Hello, everyone, and welcome to Space Cat Code. My name is Quinton. I'm a senior software engineer with around 10 years of programming experience. And today I think we're going to do something pretty cool. So I thought it would be interesting if we kind of like refactor some of the code from a previous video. This is the Tea Cozy HTML and CSS from the Codecademy project. And so the link to the video where we wrote this code initially is going to be in the description below. So check that out if you haven't. So we're going to be like refactoring this code as if it was brought to me by like a more junior engineer that wants like a more thorough code review and some advice on how to restructure some of this HTML and CSS. This is what the actual page looks like. So I'm not going to be like doing any type of like design critique or anything like that. This is purely just based upon the HTML and CSS. So let's start with the HTML. It looks like we used this class flex container in a lot of different places, and on the right hand side here we can see that that is a universal style that's being used. The flex portion of this is kind of like an implementation detail. That's what we are using for these containers, but that doesn't necessarily need to be reflected in the class name. Because what if we decide to use a CSS grid or something different? Really, it shouldn't matter how we are like making this container work the way we want it to. So we should use probably a more generic name. We can just call this like container. And so if we go through and change all these to just container, I think that's a little bit more versatile. So the next thing I notice here is we're using an image tag as the logo, which is in the left-hand side of the header. Now users always expect that to be clickable, which will navigate them to the home page. So what I'd like to do is just wrap this in an A tag and have the href, just be like, this would go to the home page, but for now we can just have it be like a hash. So now the logo is clickable, and if we navigate to one of these other anchor links, if we click on Tea Cozy, we will be popped back up to the top of the page, which is nice. We also want to make sure that we add an alt tag to our image because this has semantic meaning, and we want to reflect that for people that use screen readers. So we can say Tea Cozy Home here, and now users that are using screen readers will know what this is actually doing. Next, we see a nav, and we see some anchor links that are wrapped in spans. So I don't think these spans are really necessary. I don't think they're really doing anything. Spans are inline elements, so are A tags, so we can just remove those. And we see a little bit of styling mess up, but we can change that to an A tag, and there we go. We also don't need this display inline block because A tags are inherently displayed in inline block, so we can remove that as well. Next, we have our main container, which actually, if we are talking about semantic HTML, just how there's a header here, a nav here, there's actually a tag that we can use called main. And main is basically like the main section of a web page. And so, there should only be one main tag per page. So at that point, we can actually just get rid of our class because there will be no other main section. And here we can just call that main. That should not change any styling. There's also another semantic tag called a section. And so these are, as we see in the comments here, these are standalone sections. So we can actually call this a section as well. And we'll just do that for all these sections. So the location section as well, and the contact section. So that's a little bit more semantic since we're using semantic elements. And nothing should change on the page. So the next thing I notice is we're using a lot of heading tags. So you can see here we have an H2 followed immediately by an H4, and that's this section here. Now, when it comes to heading tags, you kind of always want to make sure that you are following a hierarchy that makes sense. So for instance, an H2 should probably always be immediately followed by an H3. In this case, I don't think we have any H1s on the page either, which in this case, this is probably our H1. This is the main heading of our entire web page. So what I'd like to do is I'd actually want this guy to be an H1 followed by an H2. And now we kind of have more of a hierarchy here in terms of our headings. So we want to make sure that we add our H1 here as well so we can get that CSS reset styling in there. And so that our stylings don't change, let's check to see what the font size is for this H2. So it looks like 33 and our H4 is 22. So I'm going to say that our H1s should have a font size of 33 pixels and our H2s should have a font size of 22 pixels. And our styles should not change, but now we have a little bit more of a hierarchy in terms of our headings. So we want to go ahead and update the heading hierarchy for the rest of the sections as well. So we have H2s followed by H4s. These should probably be H3s. So I'm going to update those as well. And we can see that the body size was using a font size of 22 pixels. That's pretty large for a default font size, I think. So I'm going to bump that down to 18 pixels. And our heading 2s are 22 pixels, so our heading 3s can maybe be something like 20 pixels. And this will change a little bit, but we can see that we still have a nice little hierarchy here. Now for this next section, we can see that we have a bunch of self-contained item divs. And within those item divs, we have an image and a span that is really a caption for that image. I think that looks great, and this is pretty well structured. We do want to make sure that we have an alt tag on all the images though. So basically every image on a website should have an alt tag. In this case though, they can be empty because the actual span itself is a caption for that image. It's basically explaining what the image is. So a screen reader is going to read that and understand that, and if we had something, like if we duplicated this and put this in the alt tag, then it's basically going to read this twice, which is not something we really want. By having those alt tags there, but having them empty, it signifies that, hey, yes, we are purposely not filling these alt tags in. Now for this next section, we can see we have an H2 at the top here and then an H3 in each individual location, which I think makes a lot of sense. The heading hierarchy here, looks good to me. And that's this section right here. Now something I'm kind of noticing is that I think this should probably be larger than these from like a UI perspective. Whenever we're viewing this, we also want to have a visual hierarchy as well. And these are probably too similar in size. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to bump up the size for the H2. I'm going to lower the global font size to 16 pixels. And maybe the H3s I'm going to bump down to 18. Now when we refresh this page, there's a little bit more of a visual hierarchy, and I think that makes a lot of sense here. So for this next section, we can see we have 3 headings, an H2 and 2 H5s, and that is referring to this section right here. Now I think the H2 probably makes sense because that is like an appropriate heading to use for a first heading of a section, but these two things are not really headings, right? This is information. This is an email and a phone number. These are not really headings. Headings should be like the first thing in a section that really kind of illustrates what the rest of the section is about, like this locations heading. So what you can do is this should really actually be a link, and we can put an href and say mail to, and then copy this email here. So now when you click on it, your default mail application will actually open up, and that email address will be pre-populated in the to field. So that's super handy, right? And we can do the same thing for this phone number as well. So instead of an H5, we can say tel, like telephone, and then put in the phone number as well. Oh, whoops, there we go. So now that is a phone number that if you were on mobile and you click on it, you would actually start dialing that number, which is a really great UX. So one thing that you might have noticed was previously when we were using our H5 tags, those were on their own distinct lines. And that's because that uses display block by default. We then switched to the A tags, which are display inline block, and that's why they're next to each other here. So if we wanted to change that, there's a couple things we could do. One thing to note is that this is now like a list of information. This is a list of links. So to be semantic here, I think what we should probably do is we should probably put this in a UL, which stands for unordered list, because there is no order to this thing. Ordered lists are more for like, steps of operations, like 1, 2, 3. So I'm going to wrap these in some LIs and ULs. So this is a list item in an unordered list. So now they're on their own lines, but you can see that like the alignment is totally off and there's these weird little circles over here. So if we inspect the page, we should be able to see that this is part of the UL itself because this is a list now. So by default, browsers will say, okay, this is a list, so I guess you want me to put these little bullet items here so that it's apparent that this is a list. Depends on the situation, but a lot of the times we actually hide those. So you can see here list style type disk. So I can put that in here and we can see the different options for this. So circle, decimal, disks, like all these different options. But we don't want anything here. So what we can do is we can say list style none. So that gets rid of the little circles. But what's going on with this alignment here? We want to reset that. So if we do margin 0 and padding 0, then we get that alignment that we want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this and put this in our universal styles section. I'm going to say, you know what, for ULs, we want to get rid of that default styling. And if I refresh the page, we should see that we're all good here. These are a little close together, so I'm also going to put a little bit of default styling for our LI items, and we say, hey, I want to put 4 pixels of margin on the bottom. And I'm using the shorthand syntax here, so this is the top, right, bottom, left. And the way I remember that is it's clockwise. So it starts out top, right, bottom, left, just like a clock. And if we refresh the page, we should see that we have a little bit of a margin there. We can actually bump that, maybe say 10 pixels. And there we go, that looks a little better. The very last section here is a footer section, so we're using the semantic footer tag, which I think is great. But again, we're using H5 here, and this is really not a heading. This is just information on the page. So I'm going to remove that H5 and use a P tag instead. And there we go. So now let's take a look at the CSS. It's definitely very common to have like some type of notion of universal styling or like a reset basically where you kind of add a bunch of default styling for all of your actual tags like your A tags and your heading tags and the ULs and LIs. So I like to see this section here at the top here. Now I will say this is pretty bare bones, and a real reset will have more things in it, but I think this is, for the purposes of a Codecademy project, this is pretty great. We also have our global all-purpose container class, which I think is great. So one thing I noticed in our header style is that we have a hard-coded height. You pretty much never want to have a hard-coded height. You really want the height of an element to be dictated by the content itself. So whether that's font size or padding, stuff like that. And I'll show you why. So if we come in here and inspect the page, we can see that this does have a height of 70. So we have our 69 height and our 1 pixel of border, giving us a height of 70. Now that's great, but since this header is hard-coded with that height, what if the contents of our heading changes over time? I'm going to take this A tag, for instance. Now I'm going to exaggerate this, but what if the font size was 100 pixels? What would happen? You can see here that it's actually overflowing outside of the header, which is something that we don't want. We want to be able to change our heading sizes and our font sizes and have the content of the containers grow with it. So what I'm going to instead do is I'm going to remove this height entirely. And we can see that it does change a little bit. Now our heading is not as tall as we want it to be. It's about 55 pixels now. So if we do 70 minus 55 is 15 divided by 2, we're looking for about 8 pixels of like padding on the top and bottom in order to get us closer to that original height of 70. So what I'm going to do here is in this section, I'm going to say padding top and bottom of 8 pixels. And now if we refresh the page, we should see that this is closer to 70 pixels. Now, if I go ahead and inspect one of these A tags and I change the font size to 100, you can see that the heading actually grows with that font size. But this is just for illustrative purposes to demonstrate that you want the height of your containers to grow with the content. Now I think with a hard-coded height for the image, that's actually one instance where it's pretty okay because this is not a container, this is an image. You cannot put something in it. So this is just by nature, we're saying, hey, we want this to be 50 pixels. So that's okay. But even then, I might recommend doing like a max height That way it's not so hard-coded. One thing that I like to recommend is to always use shorthand properties when using like padding and margin and all that, because it allows you to change things easier in the future. So we can see that we have a padding left of 10 pixels. But if we wanted to add padding right, what we would have to either add a new property or we'd have to refactor this into the shorthand. So I kind of recommend just always going shorthand, and that way it's easier to change later. So we can just change this to shorthand, top, right, bottom, left, and that should be no different. So when looking at this, why do we actually want padding left on our image though? When we take a look at the site, I don't think it's really that we want padding left on our image as much as it is that we want padding within our header itself. What if we were to swap out this image with something else? We'd probably still want that padding. So I'm actually just going to remove this and add it directly to our heading padding as well. And if we refresh, we can see that it doesn't change over here. Now, one thing you might notice is that this is really kind of jam-packed to the right-hand side here. This is because we are not actually changing the box sizing currently. So this is a really interesting thing about CSS, but by default, in the CSS box model, the width and the height that you assign to an element is applied only to the element's content box. So if the element has any border or padding, this is then added to the width and height to arrive at the final size that is rendered on the screen. This is one of the most confusing things when you're first learning CSS, in my opinion. It's pretty much understood in the CSS community that content box is a bad default, and that pretty much everything on the web these days uses border box. Now what border box does is it tells the browser to account for any border and padding in the values that you specify for an element's width and height. So if an element's width is 100 pixels, then that includes any border and padding that you have. And that's way more predictable. It's way easier to wrap your head around that, because if I say I want width 100% and padding 20 pixels, I don't want that padding to be added upon the width. The width should be 100%, and within that there is 20 pixels of padding. So we can see here exactly what's going on. We have width of 100%, and then we're including this padding, and it's actually being pushed off the screen. You can see here when we highlight over this green section here is not actually being displayed on the right hand side of our header. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say everything should be box sizing border box. Now if we refresh, bam, we get exactly what we're expecting. So now if we inspect this, we can see that yes, now we have our width 100% and our padding is within that width, which is way easier to make sense of. So now let's take a look at our A tags within our nav. We can see that something kind of weird happens where if we're not actually hovering over the link, we still are able to click it, which is probably not intended. If these were larger button-like sections that the color changed when you were hovering over it or something, then maybe, but I don't think this is really intended. So what I'd like to do is actually just remove this and see what happens. Now we don't get that unintentional side effect, but it's a little bit, they are a little bit packed together. So I'm actually going to add a little bit of margin right. So top, right, bottom, left. And now if we refresh, that looks pretty good. I would like to see the colors change a little bit though whenever we're highlighting over them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to inspect this color and maybe just get something a little darker. I honestly don't care how this actually looks because I just want to illustrate the point, but whenever we hover, let's make sure that we have a little bit of a darker color. And let's see how that looks. Yeah, I'm good with that. So now we have a little bit of a UX, a little bit of an interaction whenever we're highlighting over this so that we know that it's actually clickable. So now let's take a look at our main section. We can see some padding top here, which is supposed to be equivalent to the height of the header because this is position fixed, so that takes it out of the, the layout of the page, and we want to make sure that we have a little bit of space there. So you can actually do that programmatically to make sure that if this changes to be 100 pixels, that it will automatically put 100 pixels of space between the top of the page and the main section. It's a little out of scope for this video, but I do want to just change this to be using the shorthand. So let's change that to a nice even pixel. So top, right, bottom, left, and there should be no real change there. So the next attribute that I see here is opacity, and you should never really put opacity over large sections of a website like this. I'm not entirely sure why this is here, but opacity is good for, like subtle changes on colors, or maybe like an overlay on something like when you hover over it or something. But it's usually applied to really specific elements of a site, not like general sections like this. And to illustrate this, what if we really kind of lower that opacity? Like you're going to see that the website looks pretty strange, right? So let's go ahead and remove that, and now we can see that the page is much brighter. So the next value I see here is a hard-coded value of a width of 1200 pixels. So this kind of goes back to like those hard-coded heights that I was talking about. I pretty much never want to see like hard-coded pixel values. Now, this video is not about responsive design. Like this website is not responsive, but usually we never want to have hard-coded values, and usually sites are responsive. So if we were to just change this to max width, all of a sudden the site is going to try to be responsive. So if I refresh this page, we can see that heading text is now a little bit responsive. It's clearly, there would need to be some refactoring, but you can see like these boxes now kind of stack. And it's a little bit more fluid. So just something as simple as that is actually like all you really need to get started on responsive design. Also, margin auto here is being used to center the content on the page. So I want to be explicit about that and actually put 0 auto to make it clear that this has nothing to do with the top and bottom margin. This is really just to center the content on the page. So if I refresh, nothing should change, but now it's a little bit more explicit. So for the next section, I see another hard-coded height here. So this is really just for this section here. We want to make sure that we have a minimum height of 700 pixels. So the keyword there, I think, is minimum. So I think what we can just do is we can put min height of 700 pixels, and that won't change anything, but that'll also allow this to grow if we put more content in here and it needs to get a little bit larger. And I'm also going to remove this padding because I don't think that's really necessary since we have the 70 pixels padding on our main section. So if I refresh the page, we should be good there. Now the content within mission. So content is actually a pretty vague name when it comes to a CSS class. So I'd like to see this to be something more specific, like maybe banner. And now we can replace that. So this banner is using margin auto to vertically center the banner within the mission section. So I'm just going to add margin auto 0 there to make that a little bit more explicit, so nothing should change there. So our next section is the store section, which is this section here. And I think we can pretty much get rid of all of these hard-coded values, to be honest, because the height should really be dictated by the content itself, so that can go. We already have a max width of 1200 pixels on the container, like the main container itself. So I think we can just get rid of this and have this section expand, into the entire container. And it's going to be centered already with the things within the section, so like the actual like headings and this section as well. This section has its own styling in order to make sure that these are aligned properly. So I'm going to get rid of all of this and refresh the page. And one thing that I think will happen is we can see we have a little bit of space here and a little bit of space here. Now if we refresh the page, that's pretty much gone because of the hard-coded height that we just removed. So we already talked a little bit about the difference between margin and padding. And when it comes to margin, that's what we use to push things away from other things. We use margin whenever it's relative to other things, other items. So the way that I like to approach vertical spacing is I always like to have margin bottom. And that way it's way more predictable about like where the actual spacing is coming from. Because I've looked at like a lot of sites that have like padding top over here and margin bottom over here, but then padding top here and then margin top over here. And it's really hard to kind of make sense of a site like that. Like when you inspect it, you don't know what you're going to find. So I basically like to simplify things. And whenever I think about padding, again, that's always within the container itself. So for instance, with this right here, this section, that's going to be padding because it's within a container. I want to have padding within this section. It's not relative to anything else. But then this right here, this is going to be margin because this is a heading that I want to have some distance between the next thing that it comes across. So in terms of the spacing that we lost for this section, what I like to do is I'd like to say, hey, I want some margin bottom on this section, which is going to give us that space here. And I want some margin bottom on this section here, which is going to give us some space here. So that way, like if I were to swap this section out with something else, I know there's going to be the appropriate amount of space here because this section here pushes whatever is below it like away from it. So we always are going to have that spacing maintained. Similarly, with whatever I put in here, that should dictate its own margin bottom. So it's always good to kind of adopt that type of pattern so that it's really easy. You don't really have to think about it. It's just like you know where to put it. So with that being said, let's go ahead and do that. So in our mission section, I'm going to say, you know what, I want to have top right, bottom left, and I also want to have it in our store section. And there we go, just a little bit of spacing to make it a little bit easier on the eyes. So now let's take a look at these individual items here. We can see that we have some padding within the item itself. I don't think padding really makes sense here because there is no like container with like that has its own styling here. Like this is just black. So what is this padding really relative to, if that makes sense? Like you can see that on this left-hand side here, there's padding, but this doesn't have an outline or anything. If we had like a border, for instance, like 1 pixel solid green or something, now padding starts to make sense because this right here is our padding. But without any like context into the container itself, I don't really think the padding is doing anything. The padding is just making it a little bit more confusing about where the spacing is coming from. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to remove this. Now this is going to change the layout a little bit because we actually do have like some padding here. So this is going to decrease. So if we refresh the page, we see that's a little bit less, and we have little bit less spacing here between these, but I actually think this looks pretty good still. So I'm not really going to tweak, margin bottom for this or something to gain that back. I think this looks fine. So for the image itself, we do have a hard-coded height, but I think that's fine here because this is an image, and I think that's one of those rare exceptions to the rule. So I think that's fine. Margin of 10 pixels, I think that's fine because we are pushing like away from the caption and the rest of the images. So I think that's pretty reasonable. Display block though, I think we can remove because images are display inline block. I don't think that's really doing anything for us there. So if we remove that, this looks fine. So now let's take a look at our spans, which are these little sections down here. I'm noticing that we're using display block, and spans are like inline elements, and so if you're putting display block on a span, that probably means you should be reaching for something else. So I'm going to use p tags here instead of span tags. So p tags are display block. So I'm going to remove this. I'm going to change this to be a P. So this padding here, I don't think it's really doing anything. Like we do get a little bit of spacing here from that and maybe here. But again, when it comes to vertical spacing, I like to know that it's coming from the margin bottom of the element above it. So how nice is that to be able to look at a page and just know like, ooh, I know this spacing here is margin bottom from this. I know this spacing here is margin bottom from this. As opposed to having to be like, oh, well, maybe there's like some padding top on this thing, and maybe this has margin bottom, or maybe this has padding bottom. By having some type of standard like that, it really takes the guesswork out of this. So I'm actually going to remove this. Text align center, I'm going to remove because I know, yeah, we have a text align center in the body, which honestly is probably not something that you really see. A site generally has different types of text alignment, but for this simple site, I think that's fine to have text align center here. It happens to have, it happens to be the case that all of the text on this page is centered, so that's fine. But I'm going to remove it from the actual p tag because it's just a little redundant. Now if I refresh, we're probably going to see a little bit of weird spacing here. Yeah, and we do. And so if we inspect this, we can see that our p tags by default have margin, and that's coming from the browser styling itself. So part of what we want to do is we want to remove that margin from our p tags, and that can be in our reset styling up here. So I'm going to add a p tag and just say margin 0, And now this should look a lot better. Now, if we do want a little bit more space here, that's something we can totally do. And I think that makes sense from the item perspective. So the item itself is really what should have that margin. We could put it here, but what if we want to have like another caption, like something below this maybe? We still want to make sure that like the actual item itself is pushing, like no matter what is inside of each item, we want to make sure that it has margin with the rest of the things around it. So that's why we want to put it on the actual like container item itself. I'm just going to put item, margin, top right, bottom. There we go. Now that looks good. Okay, so now let's take a look at the location section, which is this section right here. And I can see that we have a container and then a locations. Okay, no, we have a locations ID and then a locations class. That's a little bit confusing to me. So I'm going to move the ID to the top because that's the main section, like that's the actual ID of the section. So we have a hard-coded height again. I'm going to change that to be min height so that the height of the container can grow with the content. So padding top 70, you can see that there's a little bit of padding here, but I think maybe we actually want to vertically align this maybe. So if we wanted to do something like that, I think we could just do display flex, flex direction column, and justify content center. So we can see we have a container class here on locations, and I think the padding top we can just get rid of, and I think we can get rid of all of this as well actually, and we can get rid of our container class. But if we do that, we do want to have display flex justify content center here. Now if we refresh the page there, bam, now this is vertically centered. Now I'm not sure if that's actually what we want, but it kind of looked like maybe that was something that we wanted. Maybe we actually did want just a little bit of padding there within the container, which in that case it's totally fine. So one thing that I want to change is we have duplicate names for our ID and our class, so I definitely want to make sure that those are different because that's just kind of confusing because just looking at this, like if you just glance at this, it's hard to know that these are actually different. You just see locations, but one is an ID, one is a class. So let's go ahead and change that. And if we look at our locations class, this is actually what our general container class is doing. So at this point, we can actually just remove this and just call this container actually, and that should do it. So yeah, that looks fine. So our individual location itself, we have opacity of 1. We can just get rid of that. Padding here makes sense, right? Because this is padding within the item itself. So I think we're fine there. Margin 5 pixels, 20 pixels. I don't think we really need that except for this spacing here I think is good. So I think we can maybe remove the top and bottom margin because that really wasn't doing anything. So we did lose a little bit of margin there. So if we really wanted to, we could say, you know, locations H2 margin top right bottom of 5 pixels or something. And now we have that. Now we have that back. So flex basis, that's pretty much min width, and I think that's a little bit more explicit. So I'm just going to change this to be min width, and that shouldn't change anything. So that looks fine. So I see that we also have display flex and flex direction column and justify content center within our location class. But these are actually, you know, these are p tags, and so these are already, you know, going to be on their own line because they are display block. So these 3 properties really shouldn't be doing anything here. So if we take that away and refresh, you can see that there's no actual change because these are just p tags and they're just going to be like on top of each other. There's no reason to use display flex with a flex direction because that's just the nature of a display block element. The next section here is our context section, which has a hard-coded height again, so I'm just going to change that to be min height, and that shouldn't really change anything. So our final section is the footer, which has 2 properties, text line left and padding left 20. So that's this little guy right here. You can see it's actually hugging the bottom of the page like it's at the very, very edge. So I'd actually like to see a little bit of padding there in terms of our footer. So I'm actually going to change this to be padding 20 on all sides, and if we refresh here, we should see that we now have a little bit of breathing room, which I think is good. So text align left is not something we normally need to apply, but we did have a global style here of text align center, which also normally you wouldn't do. Normally what you would want to do is, by default, text align is left. Like text has a left alignment. So by default, this is the case. And then everywhere where you need text align center, you explicitly say that. So usually text align center is not a global property like this. For this particular website, it worked pretty well actually, because literally everything on this page except for this is text align center. So I'm not really opposed to that here. But generally what you'd want to do is, you would remove this and this, and then if you refresh the page, we'll see that everything is kind of messed up now. Everything is left aligned, except this is looking fine now. And then specifically where you want your text to be centered, that's where you put it. So for instance, in this banner class, we want all of our text in our banner to be text align center, for instance. So if we refresh the page, now that's good. And you would just kind of like go through that and fix that for the rest of the sections. I'm not going to do that here though, because I think the global styles is fine for this particular project. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this and I hope you found it useful. And if you like this, I actually offer private one-on-one coaching where we can do code reviews or resume reviews or go over like career coaching or anything that you want to do, mock interviews, etc., etc. The link for that will be in the description below. I also offer courses about like interview practice and how to get ready and get into the technical interviewing mindset. So definitely check that out in the description below as well. And yeah, until next time, thank you so much again.